Hi everybody, welcome back to Capricorn Radio TV, and I am super excited today. I'm going to be talking to my co-host Hilary, and we are going to be interviewing Tom Campbell, a physicist, consciousness researcher, author of My Big Toe Trilogy, and he's an international lecturer, describes the nature of our larger reality, provides a complete theory of consciousness, and explains our purpose in connection to that larger reality. Along the way, Tom Campbell derives a fundamental science that directly answers the most pressing problems and paradoxes of modern physics. And without further ado, let's bring on Hilary first. Hi, Hilary. Well, great to see you again, Hilary.
Hi, James. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to talking to Tom. Tom and I have worked together before on the Path series documentary. We were both in London back in 2010. And it's great to see you here again. Thanks so much for joining us. I can't wait to hear what you've been up to.
Wow. Great to see you, first of all, Tom. Thank you for being on the show. I always love talking to a physicist, Tom. I did a degree in physics with astronomy, but I never used it. It's an academic degree, but it's just something I did to get out of engineering. But I just love physics. I could talk physics all day long. I mean, they always say that engineers create the world there is and physicists explain the world there is. But I like both, you know. I really do. But I mean, I couldn't do more than the physics degree. It's too much for me. But it's a heavy hitting subject, and it's something that people flock to, although they don't kind of understand a lot of the material at an academic level and the heavy hitting math that goes with it. But people do flock to it because it really does explain the essence of everything.
Yeah, well, that's what physics for. It explains how things work. It's the model of reality, if you will. That's what it does. We mathematically model reality.
Tom, tell us a little bit about your background first before we'll get into the book, the Big Toe Trilogy, of course. But tell us a bit about your physics background, what the branch of physics that you work in, and what you've made your career out of.
Well, I did my thesis research in experimental nuclear physics. After graduate school, I took a job with, it was Army Technical Intelligence. So I left academia altogether and went out to work in what I call the real world as opposed to the academic world. And I've been in that real world ever since. So that makes me an applied physicist rather than a academic physicist or a research physicist. And applied physicists basically continue that idea of modeling reality, except we model things that industry, or in this case government, wants to understand better. It's a lot cheaper if you model something, model the physics behind something to see how things react or interact than it is to actually build things and test how they interact and react. To build things costs often hundreds of millions of dollars. To model it is a lot less expensive in a computer. So that's typically what physicists do when they work out in industry, is they model systems. And my specialty became modeling large, complex systems to see how they worked. How you could, maybe reverse engineering is what I did in technical intelligence, see how systems work, what their flaws were, how they could be beaten, that sort of thing, what you could learn from technology. And then once I shifted out of that, that was probably, 35 years ago, went into the analysis of large, complex systems such as missile defense system or NASA's shuttle system, that sort of thing. And again, looking for, problems, potential problems. What could go wrong? And if it does go wrong, how do you deal with it? And then how do you fix it so it won't go wrong? So kind of the vulnerability analysis, one might say, or risk analysis would be another word for it. And when you have large complex systems, take the NASA system, for instance, there's tens of thousands of vendors making millions of pieces that all have to work together. And basically, once you get that a system that big, there isn't anybody that really understands how it works anymore as far as the details go. There's so many parts interacting with so many other parts that to understand what's actually happening at the detail level gets to be very difficult. So when they get that big, then you need to get it all programmed out into a computer so that you can do sensitivity analysis. If this part is a little bit off of its spec, what does that do to the next part downstream from it, which does something to some other part, which, and so on. And you follow this logical trail until you decide that either it doesn't make any difference, the system will compensate, or the whole system blows up and it, results in a failure and dead astronauts. So they want to know, what are these, where are these problems? Because pieces do fail, obviously, and pieces do go out of spec, and those things happen. And when they happen, what does that mean? What are the logical consequences of those things happening? So that's kind of the risk analysis area that I was working when I was working with NASA. So that's what physicists do, really, is model things. So sure. That's what I did.
I'm guessing then from that background you love problems, or you love to get to the root of a problem, or to study complexity and to reduce yourself into a situation where you can get some answers and stuff. I'm guessing that's why the Big Toe Trilogy was something that hit home to you. You get to use your skills there in a different way, Tom.
Yeah, well, there was a confluence of two major, I guess, almost independent streams at the beginning that created my Big Toe and kind of led me in the path that I ended up with. When I had only been working out in the real world for less than 6 months, I met Bob Monroe. Mm-hmm. And Bob Monroe had just built a laboratory for the study of consciousness. And he hadn't yet manned it. He didn't really know what to do with it yet. It was more of a build it and they will come sort of thing. He just knew he had to build the lab. That was his part. And then things would happen. And I was one of those things that happened. So I came along at that time and started studying consciousness with Bob Monroe. Now, Bob had these out-of-body experiences, but knew they were real because he had tested them, but he didn't know why he had them. He didn't know how he could help anybody else have them, or really too much about them. And he wanted to make it science, as opposed to just, the strange old guy who, had these experiences. He wanted to understand it so he could make it repeatable. So that's what myself and Dennis Menerick and several others that joined his lab, that's what we did. We tried to understand consciousness. So here I am working as a consciousness researcher. At about the same time, I'm working as an applied physicist. And those two just got together. And what I needed to do was understand consciousness so that I understood how it works, so that I could understand Bob's out-of-body, etc. So I spend the next 35 years studying consciousness from the inside more than from the outside. And I end up thinking that I have some idea how the world works, so I write the books. That's kind of the causal change. It got me where I am.
Hillary, tell me how you guys hooked up on the documentary. Tell me how that happened.
Oh, well, we were introduced to each other through the producers of the Path series documentary. And Tom and I did a couple Q&A cast member type premieres. We did one in upstate New York and we did one in London together. We had a good time. It was fun. It was a good project. Both April Hanna and Mike Habernig were great people to work with. And we were both in the series. Well, I think, Tom, you did a couple of the other volumes. They did 3 parts or 4 parts. And I was involved in the Life After Death one, where we talked about that spirit communication and being able to have that intuitive relationship with these sorts of things that we talk about. One of the things that I always like to hear you talk about, Tom, when you do share publicly, is your thoughts on how the intuitive feminine aspect of consciousness relates to the more logical, type mind. So it's always interesting for me to see you come from such a scientific background to be able to talk about consciousness in such an intuitive form. So could you share with our listeners, our viewers, some of those processes that you went through to kind of make those two ends meet?
Oh, well, sure. I was probably a pretty hard case as far as learning how to use my right brain as opposed to my left brain. Left brain is a kind of the technical side of people. It's the logical process side, and the right brain is the intuitive side. And now I am extremely right-brained and extremely left-brained, both at the same time. And I think that they kind of work together. I'm more whole-brained, I guess. So yes, I explore a larger consciousness system and larger realities and get around in the non-physical and do that sort of thing very easily and do that often. But at the same time, I'm still that same scientist that everything has to make sense and the logic has to be there and you have to understand exactly what you're doing and how you're doing it. So I had to do both of those things. And I started very left brain with the concept that if you can't measure it, it just doesn't matter. You can't measure it, it's not real. See, that's typical of physicists' attitude toward reality. Things that can't be measured are things that not necessarily don't exist, but they're irrelevant. Because if they're immeasurable, then they're not objective. If they're not objective, they're not repeatable. If they're not repeatable, then they're just some kind of woo-woo stuff that is too hard to get hold of, right? So that's where I started from the physics end of it. And then as I learned at Bob Monroe's about going out of body and the larger consciousness system, moving into the future, going into the past, seeing bigger pictures, and of course, it took me a year or two to convince myself that all of those experiences were indeed real, that I wasn't just making them up in my imagination. But eventually you get to the point that it cannot be denied that these experiences are real. So then the question was, well, what's happening? Where is this place? What are the constraints? What can you do there? What can't you do there? Sure, I met lots of non-physical entities that I talked to, that I exchanged information with. Was that real? Was I making that up? Well, after a few years of collecting evidence, I had to agree that I wasn't making it up. It was real, it was independent of me, and the information was accurate and valuable. So then it was a matter of finding a model, which is what physicists do. How do we model this? What can we do what kind of structure, what kind of model can I build where all of this reality, both the physical and the non-physical, all kind of work together and make sense, one continuous thing? Because I didn't like the idea of, well, you have the non-physical over here, and then you get the physical on the opposite side, and those two both just are kind of independent of each other, and they go on and do their own thing, but they're two separate things altogether. That means, if you feel that way, it means you really don't understand it. When you understand it, it all has to be one continuous thing that all makes sense from the roots up. It can't be two separate worlds. Well, we live in the physical world, but we travel with our intent and our mind in this non-physical world. That is, that's not good enough. We have to understand how does it all come together. And what was interesting is that I wrote my books with the idea that I was creating a model of consciousness. I was explaining how consciousness worked, how the larger reality worked, how intuition and out-of-body worked, those sorts of things. And after I was done and published the books, it was about a year and a half, almost 2 years later, I realized that the same theory that explained consciousness also explained physics, and that I took the exact same concepts and ideas, and I could explain things like the double slit experiment, which is unexplainable, you see, to scientists today. I could explain why speed of light's a constant, which is something that physicists don't understand today. I could explain a whole lot of things like, quantum tunneling, all the quantum effects that are kind of the weird, the strange effects. They all fall out as being very logical. They're not weird at all. They have to be just exactly the way they are. So all of that modern physics then fell out if I just applied the same concepts that explain consciousness. So consciousness is at the root. Consciousness is fundamental, and everything else is derived from consciousness. So that's kind of where I ended up. But I didn't really start out to do a better physics. But it turns out that once you understand how the whole thing works, you end up with better physics as well as better metaphysics. And you get a sense of what's happening. Now, again, this is just a model. You see, it's a model reality. We have to be careful to keep that in mind, that this is a model. And Hillary, you mentioned the women's intuition side of it, and it brings up a little anecdote that I heard a lady who was a manager at Pear Labs talk about her experiences there. And one in particular was where they were using subjects that were male and subjects that were female to do the same sort of thing. And what they were doing was modifying random number distributions, which is sort of what Pear Labs did a lot. They would have a random number creator, made random numbers, and then they would get an individual to use their intent to make the average value of those random numbers move up a little bit or move down. So let's say the random numbers were between 0 and 1, then the average should be 0.5. Well, with an intent, you could make the average, 0.55 or 0.45 or something like that. Wow. And that shouldn't be able to happen, right? These random number generators, if you run them without the intent, you get, either you don't necessarily get 5.0, but you get 0.4999999 or 5.00001. You get something really, really close to the 5. Well, they were able to shift these probability distributions with their mind. And she was telling a story about how when they asked the men to make this shift, to use their intent to shift the random numbers, that they would say, okay, men, we want to shift the random numbers to a little higher value. So let's make it 0.51 or 0.501 or something that was statistically significant. And the men would always be able to do that, but only by just a very small amount. And then they asked the ladies to do that. They said, ladies, we're going to shift these random numbers, let's say shift them higher. And it turned out that half the ladies would shift them higher, the other half would shift them lower. You couldn't tell, they go equally on both sides, but the amount of distance that they were shifted was much, much greater, you see. And that's the difference between the left brain and the right brain focus. You see, what moves these distributions is intent at the being level. Now, there's a difference between a person's being level and their intellectual level. Okay, intellectual level is basically the left brain, the things that we know, the things that we, our logical processes, that sort of thing. And generally, men tend to be on the scheme of whether you're left brain or right brain. They tend to meet into the left brain logical process. Women tend to be more to the right brain intuitive process. That's just kind of the way it is when you test people in the culture. Now, of course, there's men to the right, and there's women who are really good left brain people, but just in general, that's the way it breaks out between males and females. Only these ladies were using an intent from the being level. The being level is where you are at the core of you. It's the kind of your center, if you will, rather than at the intellectual level, you are kind of who you want to be, who you think you are, what's logical. It's more your image, you're being the way you think you should be, as opposed to being the way you are. So the ladies from the being level were having a much greater effect because their intent could more powerfully move these random number generators, but the men were always accurate in how they moved them, but couldn't move them very far. And that was just a telling experiment, if you will, scientific experiment that was done with great scientific protocol that shows you the difference between the intuitive right brain side and the left brain side, the logical process side. So yes, ladies do have a bit of a step up, a bit of an advantage in this right-brained intuitive connection, because that's just more natural for them to operate out of the being level and not so much out of the intellectual level. For instance, your emotions basically come out of the being level. Your emotions, you don't think about how I'm going to feel. You don't say, I'm going to feel happy about that, or I'm going to feel angry about that. That's not an intellectual process. Your emotions are just who you are. They come right out of the being level. When you dream, your dreams, the choices you make in your dreams come right out of the being level. You don't really intellectualize about what you're going to do in a dream. You just do it. So dreams are very therapeutic that way, because what you do in a dream is the way you are. The choices you make in the dream reality come straight from your core, not from your intellect. So that's just a little difference there. Yes, the ladies get there a little easier, but there's an upside and downside to both right brain and left brain. If you are right-brained, you intuitively know what the answers are. You intuitively connect the things, but you don't really understand why or how. And if you had to explain it to somebody exactly what you were doing and what it meant, you can't, because you don't have that into terms of logical process. If you're left brain, you understand exactly why you're doing what you're doing and all the piece parts in the process and why they go together like that, you see, but you don't have any connection to this larger, being level, intuition. So you really need to combine both of those so that you can explore that intuitive world, explore the world of non-physical, and at the same time apply right brain logical process to it. And that's kind of where I fell in, because I was a physicist who happened to end up working at Bob Monroe's laboratory to study consciousness. So I just, got a foot in both doors, and took me a long time to get those two processes working together. But it's a natural thing that happens. If you just let this intuitive side grow, it takes you where it needs to go. You don't have to direct that. The intellect doesn't direct it. It just goes where it goes. And eventually it takes that logical part with it.
Wow. Tom, where are we at today in terms of consciousness studies? Set aside the Monroe Institute, just on pure science. Are we on grips with any of it? Is there anything fascinating that we're trying to get some answers pretty soon? I know there's a lot of independent research groups, and I think there's people out there thinking that consciousness studies is going to be revamped with psychedelics or hallucinogens. I don't think that's the answer. I think that maybe help with other sorts of healing, but I don't think that's going to give us insights into consciousness in a deep respect. But there are some scientific studies. But where are we at today in pure science, pure academia with consciousness studies?
Okay. Well, if you go to academia, what you will find is that the researchers there are trying very, very hard to figure out how the brain creates consciousness, how you derive consciousness from the physical. That's because in their mind, what is fundamentally real is the physical, and that physical creates and derives everything else. Therefore, consciousness somehow has to have its roots in the physical. It's a physical process that creates it, and that's just wrong. That's 180 degrees away from the truth. Consciousness is fundamental, and the physical is not. So you're not going to derive consciousness from the physical. You're going to derive the physical from consciousness, because the logic flows in the other direction. So most all the research in consciousness going on in academia is entirely wrong-headed, and basically they've been spinning their wheels on that same subject for 50, 60 years and haven't gotten anywhere. There is no. Now, every once in a while, one of them will say, wow, I got a new idea. Let's see, it's quantum events in microtubules. That's the answer. And then, of course, nothing ever comes of that. You know, what happens in the scientific world is they found this, you know, there's this relationship that they found, and they believe that it means a lot more than it does. And that is, they know that in the world of science, they know that quantum mechanics and quantum mechanical events, quantum events, show non-locality. Okay, that means they're not stuck in this space and time. Okay, they are kind of beyond space and time. So they know that, and they know that consciousness isn't stuck in space and time. That shows non-locality, and they go, therefore consciousness must be a quantum event. All right. Well, that is not good science. It's not even good logic. That'd be saying like rockets fly and birds fly, therefore birds must be little rockets. You know, just because the two things have an attribute in common, like they both fly, doesn't mean that there's a causality, you know, at the root between those two things. That's just bad science. So, but it's the only thing they have, because they see that this consciousness, it's non-locality, it's not confined by space and time, and the only other thing that is like that is quantum events. So that's why they make that marriage, and they've been clinging to that because they don't have any other answers. Otherwise, they're just empty-handed, no theories, no ideas, nowhere to start. So they have this idea that somehow quantum physics is at the root of consciousness, and it's not like that at all. The reason you get the quantum physics events, non-local, is because this is a virtual reality, not a physical reality. It's computed, and it is our physical universe is a simulation that is probabilistic. And because it's probabilistic and computed, you get all this quantum weirdness because of that. So again, consciousness is at the root, and quantum mechanics and that explains our physical reality it shows the attributes of consciousness, because consciousness is probabilistic, because it's a virtual computed reality in consciousness. That's what the quantum effects, these strange quantum effects are happening because of that, not because of the other way around, that the strange quantum effects are somehow creating consciousness. See, again, that's trying to do the causality in the opposite direction. So it doesn't work. And that's why, though every once in a while you'll see one of these great big breakthroughs that somebody has a big idea, they never really go anywhere. Now that's academia. Because, see, academia, in order to be credible, has to be very science-like. Science-like means it has to be, so we say, objective. It has to start from the physical world. The physical has to be the beginning of everything, because that's the only acceptable idea in academia. If you don't start from there, then you're woo-woo and you're discounted. So they're kind of trapped. They're caught in a belief trap. You see, they've painted themselves into a corner with their beliefs about the nature of reality, and the corner they've painted themselves into doesn't contain the answers. So they're just kind of struggling with this idea of consciousness and getting nowhere at all with it.
To add to that, Tom, I mean, we've had 90 years almost since the Solvay conference, where the greatest minds met. They hammered out the quantum physics problems. I mean, it was a unique moment in history when the greatest minds all sat down at that conference to hammer out all this quantum weirdness and quantum math. And, you know, I don't understand it, because we have this quantum tunneling, the tunneling effect, where we go through these barriers, and we have this spooky action at a distance as well. We understand it in an engineering sense. We understand how to take the rules of quantum physics and make mobile phones, because the tracks on the wires can only get so close together because the electrons can get confused and be in another one. So there's constraints on the size of a mobile phone because of quantum tunneling. We know how to use the formula. But what we don't seem to have, and what you just alluded to, is that in the last 90 years, we don't have any acceptance of the quantum weirdness. We know it's there. We measure it. We kind of accept it, but we don't accept the weirdness. It's like, it's an exotic world. It's very, very exotic. And why not, start from an exotic point?
Well,
wouldn't that describe synchronicity, Tom? We have these events that happen between ourselves and other people that we can't logically explain, but if we follow that thread, we find logical connections that happen to lead us to places where we normally wouldn't have gone.
Yes, it works exactly the same way. The synchronicity is a very similar thing to the quantum effects, and it works for the same reason. It's because of the nature, the statistical, probabilistic nature of the reality and the nature of consciousness. So that's logically derivable. The synchronicity kind of falls out of my theory as a kind of logical necessity. That's true. You go back to this conference you were talking about, and if you listen to the scientists back then, you'll find that they were really excited. I mean, this was like the beginning of a whole new era in physics. It's like we realized that this physical reality that we thought was fundamental is not. We realized that everything we thought about the way the world worked was wrong. Now, we don't know exactly what's right yet, but wow, we're just at the first steps of a new adventure to really understanding the world in a new way. And most of the quantum physicists that were the kind of the fathers of quantum physics, they were all very excited and very enthusiastic about where this might lead. And then what you'll find is about 10 or 20 years later, because they couldn't really put their finger on what was happening, they could describe the results, but they didn't know why they should be that way. People kind of gave up on it and said, well, that's just strangeness, and nobody will ever know. And it's just one of those things we have to accept that's beyond our knowing. And pretty soon everybody gave up on the idea of a brave new world. Instead, we get to, Feynman's famous quote of shut up and calculate. In other words, don't ask me about how this works. Nobody knows. We'll never know. Just shut up and calculate. And we can calculate the right answers. You see, like you say, we have tunnel diodes that are common parts in electronic gear, and they work because of tunneling, which is a quantum effect. So we use quantum effects. We know the math and can predict what works, and the math will show you, that it works this way given these assumptions. And the assumption is basically that particles aren't really particles; they're probability distributions. They're just a probability of being somewhere at some place at some time and acting in some way and interacting in some way. It's all probability. So if you realize that the world is just probability and not this solid, massive place we thought it was, then you can crunch the math and you can understand what's going on. But this idea that our world is probability just never felt good to the scientists that came after, and even the scientists that were there. They said that just doesn't make sense. So instead, we could go down this probability path, but instead we're going to go down the particle path. So they started to define everything and all interactions at that time in terms of particles. They could have gone the other way, but they didn't, because particles felt good. Particles felt, intuitive, like that's the physical stuff that we know. They're these little particles. And since then, they have been going down basically the wrong path. They've had a belief about the nature of reality, and it's called material reductionism, and that is that the fundamentals of reality are material, and they're all based on smaller and smaller pieces. And these small pieces kind of build up upon each other like Legos, and you take subatomic particles, and then you build atomic particles, which then build molecules, which then build the stuff that we experience in the macro world. And all of that basically is wrong. The world doesn't work that way. It's really a statistical world. So that's the problem. So for the last 90 years, we've been going in the wrong direction with a belief about the nature of reality that's blinded us to the true nature of reality. And it was a choice. It wasn't just that, the science led us there. Our choice was to go with particles rather than to go with the probability description, because the probability description just didn't make sense, didn't feel right, and the particles did. So it was that sense of the material world is at the root is what caused us to take that wrong turn. And we've been, like I say, painted into that corner ever since and can't seem to get out because the answer isn't there.
I think you're right. And I liked what you said. We had a chance at a brave new world and we didn't seize it. And I bizarrely, that's the one thing that attracted me to physics. It's the one thing that attracted me was the philosophy surrounding the whole thing. And when I was taught physics, I was taught what went on and what happened and the many worlds interpretations and all the different philosophy derivations of what it all means, but it was all taught in some academic way, and this is just all nonsense in the background, and you don't get bogged down with that. And like you say, shut up and calculate and get back to the math and do your physics. And it's like, I think that's the most exciting part of the whole thing. And I think that physics kind of needed that, because had we not really discovered quantum physics, we would have been just going down this left brain route and been so dogmatic in our thinking, and not a holistic left brain, right brain way. And I think the philosophy has forced us back into this way of thinking again, to look at things from both aspects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you have to have, if you only look at the one piece of a picture, then you can never get the whole answer. And that's what science has been doing for the last 90 years. That's beginning to change now, because scientists are now realizing that this is a virtual reality. They haven't yet discovered that this virtual reality is probabilistic. That's an obvious step, right? Because quantum mechanics is probabilistic. You might think that would be an easy step to make. But they still want it to be deterministic, because if it's deterministic, then it's a big machine. And working with the reality as a big machine makes left brain people feel very secure, because reality then is just logical process. Reality is just mathematics and logical process. And that feels like they understand that and they can work with that. So they want it to be deterministic, but of course it's not. And quantum mechanics tells them it's not. And now they're realizing that it's a virtual reality, but they're thinking, well, then it must be a deterministic virtual reality. You see, work again from the ground up, and it's not like that. It is a virtual reality, but it's a statistical and probabilistic virtual reality. So step one is that it's a virtual reality. 3 cheers. Scientists are going there. They're getting that. They're seeing that this world is not physical, that the world is computed. And that's a stance now that is popular and being taken more and more every year by physicists all over this planet. That used to be, woo-woo fringe. Even a decade ago, there was only a handful of physicists who would have said that was a good idea. And now it's in every physics department on the planet that this is a virtual reality. Why? Because the experiments can't be explained any other way. So it's just the experiments are forcing physicists to see this as a virtual reality. It's only a matter of time before they realize it's a probabilistic virtual reality. And then eventually they'll realize that consciousness is the computer. Wow. And that will then put the whole thing together for them.
I have a question, Tom. When you talk about consciousness and psychic events, what do you tell people who don't necessarily come from a scientific background or understand the language that you describe it in? How would you describe physics and being psychic phenomena?
Well, psychic phenomena, or we'll call it paranormal phenomena, are perfectly logical when you see it from a bigger picture. When you understand the science of reality, then there are no paranormal phenomena. They're just phenomena. The paranormal are normal. There's nothing para about them. Para means beyond normal. And they're not beyond normal at all. They're just there. They're expected. They're part of our reality. So the people who are connected to these psychic kind of events and experiences and processes, they're just experiencing another part of this reality that is just as real and just as fundamental as, as the other parts of this reality. It's not, what they're doing isn't any less real or any less substantial than anything that's done, say, in the physical world. It's just different. Our reality is bigger than just the physical. When you see the whole big reality, you see the paranormal part of it is just another normal part of it. So I tell them that they're not doing anything weird or not doing anything particularly, far out. They're just interacting with this reality in a way that is there for us to interact with it. It's just one that the people who believe everything has to be based on the physical, they don't see it because they basically deny it because it is counter to their beliefs. So when a scientist who is a believer in the physical reality being all there is sees something that's paranormal, they simply deny it because it's a direct conflict with their sense of reality, with what they believe to be true about reality. Therefore, it doesn't happen. Therefore, you're making it up. Therefore, it's just all in your mind. You're very suggestible. You do these things. And when you look at the research to show that, well, it does make sense. Look at Pear Labs and what they've done, with intent moving probability distributions. They basically refuse to look. They refuse to deal with it. They say, yeah, okay, we see you're doing this, but there's probably an error someplace, and we really don't have time to tell you where it is. You see, that's just basically denial, and that's what you get. So that's why we have science, and then we have woo-woo stuff that is non-scientific. That's just a head-in-the-sand view. The scientists have a very narrow view of reality. They don't see the bigger picture. Otherwise, that paranormal stuff is not weird at all. It's just natural. It's just there, and people access it and use it and live in it and experience it and experiment with it just like they would live in and use and experience and experiment with the physical. It's just another dimension, if you will, for us to experience because we're not physical bodies. We're consciousness. We're individuated units of consciousness, and this physical body is our avatar in this virtual reality game, you see? So as consciousness, we live in a much bigger world than just this little virtual reality. That's like if you were playing World of Warcraft, you live in a much bigger world than the elf in your game of World of Warcraft. That elf is stuck in that little World of Warcraft world, and you're not because you're that elf's consciousness. Well, that's the way it is with us. We really are consciousness. We're not stuck in this little physical world. We can do a whole lot of other things with our consciousness, with our mind and our intent that's available to us.
Could you speak a little bit about the non-physical entities that you were seeing when you were first experimenting with your consciousness studies?
Oh, I ran into non-physical entities way back when I was like somewhere between 6 and 7 years old. I had entities come and taught me how to go out of body then, and then ran me through a lot of training programs and things, and then I lost all of that for a while until after I was at Monroe, and then all those memories, all those experiences came back, and there are, we are not the only game in town. This physical universe, now we have this one little planet in our large physical universe, but if we just look at the whole physical universe, that's just one virtual reality frame. There are lots of virtual reality frames in the larger consciousness system. So there are lots of other beings, if you will, in the larger consciousness system. And there's lots of different kinds of virtual reality. Some are like ours, like physical, and some are like your dream reality, and some are like the transition reality when your avatar here dies and your consciousness goes on, you have a transition reality you go through. It's another virtual reality. The out-of-body is basically another virtual reality. So there's lots of virtual realities, and they're all inhabited by individuated units of consciousness just like us. So you can interact with them at that level. The interactions are telepathic, which means you don't necessarily get linear words and things like that. Language isn't an issue because you're just passing thoughts, ideas, concepts back and forth. Telepathy isn't that you hear somebody else talking in your mind. Telepathy is that you get an idea, you get a thought, you get a whole paragraph, sometimes a whole chapter of understanding just comes, all at once. That's the way telepathy works. So it's not really a language issue at all. It's an intent issue. So yes, I have interacted with lots of various entities from a lot of different reality frames, some of them physical. You can go to other physical realities like ours, where it's very similar. It's a physical place. And when you get there, you have a choice. You can either just kind of observe. Okay, so you're non-physical to that reality, but you're observing that reality, and you can commute telepathically with those people. Or if you're experienced enough, you can actually manifest a physical body and then walk around as a physical person among those people in that reality. That's another option. So you have to be a little more savvy to do that. The first thing usually is just to be an observer, but you can become a physical body in some other physical reality frame. And that's not that unusual. I mean, look, we do that all the time in our dreams, right? We have a physical body in our dreams that we're interacting with other physical entities in our dreams, but we think that's all just made up. It's not all made up. That dream reality is an independent reality frame. It's not just something we imagine in our head. That's another reality frame, and what we do there is the same thing we do here. We make choices with our free will, and how we make those choices affects how we grow up. What we become. So it's just another place to learn, just like here. There's lots of entities, lots of beings all over. There's a lot of life forms, a lot of stuff going on. We think this universe of ours is the end of everything. All reality is in this universe. This universe is just one little virtual reality in a much larger consciousness system. So we're not the be all and end all of sentient beings here. We're just a speck in something much, much larger.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to bring in the idea of AI, artificial intelligence. There's a lot in the movies at the moment where you can have your consciousness downloaded. Do you think we'll ever get to that point, Tom? Do you think that or more importantly, do you think it's a case that we cannot separate the biological infrastructure from the consciousness, i.e. human beings, where we have the brain and we have to receive this consciousness that comes into the body, it leaves the body, whatever. Do you think we'll be able to separate those two already, or it's just a natural thing that
Those two are always separate. We don't live in the body. Your consciousness isn't something that lives in your body, and it doesn't live in your brain. That's just a metaphor. People say that because they're convinced that physical reality is fundamental, but it doesn't work that way. It's the same way it works with us as it does with you playing the World of Warcraft. Okay, if you're playing an elf in the World of Warcraft, or a plumber in The Sims or whatever, you are that elf's consciousness. You make all the choices. But the elf then actually does it follows your choice. If you say run, or you say fight, or you say jump up and down, or dance, or whatever you tell that elf to do, that elf will do that. And then that elf has consequences of doing that. If it runs, it ends up with one future. If it, fights, it ends up with a different future. If it goes into that cave, it ends up with a different future. So depending on the choices, things happen. And that's the way we work. But we wouldn't say, well, will we ever learn to separate ourselves from that elf? Can we, that doesn't really make sense. We don't live in our body. We don't live in our head. We are a consciousness getting a data stream, and we interpret that data stream as this physical reality. So you're sitting at your computer, you're getting a data stream. A data stream displays as pixels on your screen, and you interpret it as that elf's reality. You see, and there's a rule set to that reality, and you can't do the things other than what the rule set allows. So the elf can't walk through trees, can't fly, has to open doors to go inside of houses. It's got all these rules that it has to abide. Falls in the water, it'll drown if it doesn't know how to swim. So that's the rule set that defines the reality. So you as consciousness can't do anything with that elf that is, outside the rule set of that virtual reality. Well, our rule set here is our science, our biology, our physics and chemistry. That basically is our understanding of the rule set. So our bodies have to abide by those rules, but our consciousness is totally separate. So what happens with AI is that if we create a platform that can support free will choice, then consciousness will grow on that platform. Okay, now think of ourselves, our human bodies. They're just virtual bodies in a simulation, but they're a platform that can make choices. Okay, they have the complexity to make choice, free will choice. So consciousness can what can we say, attach, can run, can play that avatar, and then make those choices that are available according to the rule set. Well, we make a computer that has free will choice, then consciousness will just begin to grow in that computer. You see, so you don't program in consciousness, you create an environment in which consciousness can interact, and consciousness just begins to interact there. So that's the way it works. So it's not that we will make a video game where the elves are actually conscious. We will make a computer that will become conscious, not because we program that into it, but because that computer has enough flexibility and free will choice. Now, the free will choice can't be a deterministic choice. It can't be an algorithmic choice. It has to be a choice of it has to have options. It can do A, B, or C. It's not compelled to do any of those. It gets a choice, and it has to make that choice based on history, on its understanding, on the things that have happened before. Its database. It has to look at those choices and say, well, I could do these, and this is kind of what will happen over here and maybe there, but there's uncertainty in all of those choices. Don't know what's going to happen down any of those paths until you actually take them. So if you can create that kind of a computer arrangement where your software and hardware gets these choices that are uncertain, then if those choices are interesting enough to consciousness to want to use that computer then as an avatar, then consciousness will. So now you'll have avatars that are computers and avatars that are human bodies and avatars that are dogs and cats and horses. These are all basically avatars, and if they make decisions that are interesting enough to consciousness, then a consciousness will play that avatar. So that's how you get conscious computers. You don't somehow make consciousness into the character, you see. Now, if each conscious computer then is operating a little avatar in a video game, then you'd say that those characters in the video game were conscious. Just like we say the elf is conscious because we're the consciousness playing it, see. We are the consciousness plays the elf, so the elf appears to be conscious in that game. Well, if you had a computer that was conscious playing an elf, then that elf would appear to be conscious in that game. But the avatar and the consciousness have to exist in two separate reality frames. Now, have I just gotten confusing? And
not at all. Actually, it's so refreshing talking to you, Tom. It's so refreshing talking to you because I think you're definitely unique. I know a lot of academic people, they just don't have, there's like you say, they're stuck in either a left brain world or a right brain world, and I think you got a wonderful balance, Tom, and it's very logical but very open too. I love it. Tom, do me a favor, take a moment to give out your website before I forget.
Okay, for anybody who's listening to this and totally mystified because I'm just talking about, I'm just making statements now because it takes hours and hours to actually do the derivations. Go to www.mybigtoe.com, and that will be my website. From there, you can go to YouTube, where I have about 130, 140 videos. All of the talks I give, all the interviews, all of the lectures, all end up free on YouTube. And my books can be had for free on Google Books. Or you can go to Amazon or any place else that sells books and find them there. But there's a lot of material out there, and almost all of it is free. So if you have an interest, then you can actually find the derivations to all of this strange sounding stuff that I'm talking about. It actually is logical, and it is good science. It's just it's hard to make that case in an hour or two. It takes more like 20 hours to make that case.
Sure. Well, coming up to the top of the hour, I'll throw the last final thoughts to Hillary.
Well, I'm just intrigued by all this, Tom. Thanks for sharing. I think people need to hear the scientific stuff. I think the woo-woo world, the world of energy, and people who do a lot of the intuitive stuff like I do need that science to back up some of their theories and their thoughts, and the worlds need to come together. And I think humanity is headed in that direction. So thanks for joining us, and thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Oh, you're welcome, Hillary. It's my pleasure. It's been fun.
Well, thank you for your time today, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm going to talk to you in the not too distant future.
Okay.